20,000 people attended this man's funeral. Denzel Washington was nominated Best Supporting Actor for playing him, and before he died, about 5 million people were afraid just to say his name. Yep, that's 5 with 6 zeros after it. This is the face of Steve Biko, the African revolutionary you've probably never heard of. And in 1978, the apartheid government of South Africa banned his face. Why? Well, in 1978, roughly 5 million out of a total of 25 million South Africans were white, with all political and economic power firmly fixed in the hands of this 20% minority. So, when Steve Biko burst on the scene in the late 60s saying this,
"We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people. And those people will have the same status before the law, and they will have the same political rights before the law."
things were bound to get dangerous very quickly. But who actually was Steve Biko, and why was the South African government so afraid of him that even after brutally assassinating him, they had to ban his face appearing on t-shirts? Strap in tight, you're about to witness the legend of a one-man army. Steve Biko was born on the 18th of December 1948 to Matthew and Alice Biko, the third of 4 children living in Ginsberg Township, Eastern Cape. Initially constructed to hold black workers, Ginsberg was expanded in the 1930s to rehouse thousands of South Africa's black natives in out-of-sight ghettos removed from white settler society. When Biko lived there as a child, Ginsberg had 1 toilet for every 4 family. And after his father died prematurely, Biko's mother was left to look after him and his 3 siblings all on her own, which she did working as a housemaid to whites. So, you're a young Steve Biko, you see poverty everywhere. You're a second-class citizen on the land of your ancestors, your mother's running house to house, looking after other people's children for slave wages, and your father's dead. What do? The only thing you can do, you get smart. Book smart. See, for many blacks in Biko's day, neither sports nor showbiz was an option. Everything in South Africa was segregated. South African society was white society. Never mind that 80% of the population were of indigenous black stock. If you were black in Biko, South Africa, you were airbrushed out of the picture. But this didn't stress young Biko at all. Studious and academically gifted, he earned scholarships to prestigious primary schools established by Christian missionaries. There, Biko excelled and regularly topped his classes. By all accounts, he was a child genius. At 16, he won another scholarship to the famous Lovedale College. This is where things changed for Biko. Barely 3 months into his time at Lovedale, he and his brother Kaya were accused of being part of something called the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, PAC for short. Now, were PAC terrorists, lynching minority white South Africans en masse? Nope. Were they burning crosses on white people's lawns and assaulting their politicians? Nope. So what then? Well, PAC's leader, Robert Sobukwe, was organizing protests against the pass laws, a series of legislation brought in by the ruling white minority National Party in the 1960s. These laws were the codification of centuries-old Dutch settler rules forcing blacks to carry identification in order to restrict their movement and confine them to designated ghettos. Robert Sobukwe's PAC were simply speaking and fighting against this, one of the many unjust laws under the apartheid regime. That is, until PAC was criminalized, banned by the government in 1960. Thereafter, any members of PAC were liable to imprisonment for being part of what the government now called a terrorist group. And in 1964, that's exactly what 16-year-old Biko and his brother Kaya were accused of. Years later, Biko said of this incident, quote, "They took us to the police camp, decided I was the younger of the 2, and sent me in first for a sort of heavy grilling. 7 people around me. It didn't take long for them to discover that I didn't know a single thing about it. They were talking about friends of mine who had been arrested. I didn't know these people. This was how I got a glimpse into what was going to happen to my brother. I never saw him thereafter. He just disappeared. I saw him 10 months later. It was a bitter experience. I began to develop an attitude which was much more directed at authority than at anything else. I hated authority like hell." End quote. And can you blame him? Biko was expelled from Lovedale immediately after his release from police custody. His life seemed to be in ruins. A year went by in which he couldn't get into any school in South Africa, even the segregated blacks-only schools. But Biko was irrepressible. Somehow, he worked his way into St. Francis College in Durban, and by the time he was 19, he had enrolled in the University of Natal Medical School. Thing was, Biko wasn't really interested in medicine. Left to himself, he would have studied law, except law would draw too much attention to him as the Afrikaner government suspected blacks who studied law, not wanting too many black South Africans educated on what few rights they actually had. With his true mission in mind, Biko couldn't afford to stick out too much too quickly at university. So, medicine it was. At the University of Natal, however, Biko began surgery on a sick country first. Now, at this time, South Africa was on fire, and so was the world. The Sharpeville protests of 1960 saw 69 black South Africans shot to death by the police. Up north, the Belgians were back in the Congo, this time with the Americans, both pretending they were fighting communism while secretly sponsoring the killings of anti-colonial leaders like Patrice Lumumba. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Africa's great Pan-African leader, had been deposed in a CIA-scheduled coup. Want proof? Check out our video on that whole saga, link in the description. Meanwhile, in America, President Kennedy had been shot to death by, well, not this guy, that's for sure. Malcolm X followed soon after, and sure enough, MLK was in the crosshairs. This was the era of big names making big calls and going out with big bangs. Steve Biko was about to join this roster of big names making bold calls, and yes, with the same tragic big bang ending. But first, the big call: black consciousness. What was it? I can't tell you. I have to show you. First, imagine you're black in South Africa in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. You there? Okay, great. Here are just a few of the laws you had to deal with in the land of your forefathers. Ready? Go. The Mines and Work Act reserved any skilled work in the country's crucial mining industry for whites only. The Native Building Workers Act made it a crime for blacks to perform skilled construction labor in white homes. The Native Labour Act made it illegal for blacks to strike, thus prohibiting black trade unions. The Bantu Education Act banned blacks from white educational institutions. Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of the act, justified it, saying, "There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice?" I know, but it gets worse. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act made it illegal for blacks to marry outside their race. The Natives Land Act defined less than 1/10 of South Africa as black, quote, reserves, and stopped any purchase or lease of land by blacks outside these reserves. And the extension of university education made it a criminal offense for non-white students to register at whites-only universities. Oh, and the white Afrikaner government didn't forget its Asian population either. The Asiatic Land Tenure Act, 1946, confined Asian ownership and occupation of land to certain clearly defined areas of towns, banning Asians from owning or occupying property without a permit. Okay, you get the picture. Apartheid was a layered system of oppression designed to keep blacks and colored South Africans in a bottomless hole they couldn't even hope to escape. Now imagine Biko at Natal University, sitting at a meeting of anti-apartheid white students talking about the, quote, erosion of freedom in South Africa. "We have no freedom," was the response one black student made to a gathering of National Union of South African Students, NUSAS. But this student wasn't Biko. Anybody who knew Biko knew him as a quiet observer of other people. A very reluctant leader, someone who carefully took notes before taking action. Denzel Washington picked up on this trait in learning how to portray him. Listen.
When Steve was in college, there were two different organizations who were trying to get together on a way to present their argument to the college about their being treated unfair by the government. And they were having this big argument going back and forth, and Steve was the type of guy who would sit in the back of the room and just listen. Just listen. He's not a podium type guy. He would sit in the back and just listen. And then finally they said, well, look, Steve, why don't you give us something? And such an intelligent man, had such a knowledge of history. In that particular argument, he started his argument by going back in time and talking about whatever the points he made to then bring out why these two groups should be together. And the guy who told me the story, who was one of the arguing groups, he said, by the time he finished, he said, we forgot what it was we were even arguing about. We were just sitting there listening to him.
No, the black student who spoke wasn't Biko. Biko was busy watching, busy working out how best to channel his rage. Specifically, his rage at, quote, this sort of appalling silence on the part of Africans and the tendency to hide behind the skirts of white liberals who were speaking for them, end quote. This is where Biko's concept of black consciousness came in. Black consciousness was essentially blacks, the people who actually suffered the oppression in South Africa, thinking out and carrying out their own solutions for themselves, without the watering down of those solutions by whites, even sympathetic whites. This meant Biko and his fellow blacks at university breaking away and creating their own group called the South African Student Organization, SASO. Biko and like-minded friends felt that, well-meaning as they were, wise students didn't get it. For example, NUSAS, while claiming to fight against apartheid, still enabled those rules. Take an incident where NUSAS was holding an anti-apartheid conference in 1967 at Rhodes University, Grahamstown. Dormitories were provided for conference delegates in a building that only allowed whites and Asians. What did NUSAS do for black delegates? In its generosity, it directed them to lodge at a local church building. But black consciousness wasn't about revenge. Here, let Biko and his fellow founders describe it for you themselves. Biko said it was an inward-looking process meant to infuse people with pride and dignity. The idea was to awaken the people as to who they are. Barney Pityana, Biko's right-hand man at SASO, said their movement was about getting the black man to see himself with the same pride as he had preceding any invasion, quote, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth, close quote. Essentially, Biko and his friends thought if blacks were going to make South Africa a country where everybody was equal, blacks had to rewire their minds and first undo the mental damage done by white oppression. What did white South Africans think of this? Donald Woods, the man who wrote the book about his friendship with Biko, which would later be made into an Oscar-nominated movie, spoke for many white South Africans at the time when he said he at first thought it was, quote, apartheid in reverse. NUSAS, who Biko and his friends broke away from, were reportedly traumatized. They simply couldn't see beyond their sorry not sorry, self-satisfied attempts to do the black man good. And the South African government, well, they loved it at first. Biko was probably the first black anti-apartheid leader they cheered on. To them, SASO's break from NUSAS vindicated their belief that blacks and whites should be separate, blacks under whites of course. With Mandela and so many other black anti-apartheid heroes either locked up or murdered by the regime, if Biko's separation from whites at NUSAS was the best blacks could now come up with, then happy days. But the government soon changed its tune when it found out what black consciousness meant in practice. Because what it meant in practice was shaming NUSAS and everyone else who thought they could influence the government on behalf of black South Africans. As far as Biko was concerned, the white minority National Party of South Africa was completely illegitimate, and any white society in South Africa was, quote, going to have to accommodate black thinking. What black consciousness meant in practice was black community programs, BCPs, which drew funding from sympathetic whites and blacks around the world for healthcare and education initiatives meant to foster black self-reliance. One of these is the Zanampilo Clinic, which today is known as the Biko Clinic. Now this is where the apartheid regime started getting nervous. Biko was drawing international attention to the plight of blacks in South Africa. And that was embarrassing for the Afrikaner National Party. But not only was Biko drawing eyes, he was drawing money, funding for his cause to empower the black man. Church organizations were sending help for Biko's projects. Something called the Anglo-American Corporation also began sending funds. The South African government were no longer smiling. Mandela was in jail, Robert Sobukwe under house arrest, or what was left of him. The troublemakers were supposed to be out of the way. What was a university student doing causing all this mayhem? The challenge before the National Party was simple. No, it wasn't to reconcile with the blacks of South Africa. No chance. The challenge, as the white minority National Party saw it, was as brilliantly put by that philosophical masterpiece, The Sound of Music. Yes, how to solve a problem like Bantu Steve Biko. In 1973, the South African National Party found an answer. It placed what it called a banning order on Steve Biko. This was effectively house arrest. It meant Biko couldn't leave his district at King Williamstown. Neither could he carry on any work for a political or charitable organization. Biko wasn't allowed to speak publicly or to more than one person at a time. He could also not be published nor even be quoted. That's how dangerous the South African government thought Steve Biko had become. It became a criminal offense to quote the man. But Biko knuckled down and kept up his work with the BCPs secretly, even if he couldn't himself earn any money from it legally. This took a toll on his marriage, as you can imagine, just as the affairs he was notorious for also did. Wading through anonymous death threats against his wife, his children, and the obvious surveillance the South African government placed him on, and their constant defamation of his character in the media, to which he was not allowed to respond, Biko soldiered on. Now, one of the things that made Biko such a great leader was his ability to calmly watch and anticipate his opposition's next move. He did this in 1975 when he's reported to have warned fellow leaders of the Black Consciousness movement not to demonstrate in support of Mozambique finally gaining independence from Portugal. For Biko, it was obvious the government would use the demonstration as an excuse to crack down harder on their movement. Biko thought the risks were greater than the rewards. They were. The demonstrations went ahead anyway, and the police pounced, arresting around 200 activists. 200. When charges were brought in court, Biko reluctantly was at the forefront of the consciousness movement yet again, standing in defense of friends destined for the infamous Robben Island prison. Biko became a force of nature. If you want to see a masterful reconstruction of Biko taking the witness stand to defend his friends and black consciousness, then watch the court scene and Denzel Washington's performance in the film Biko.
When you and others in black consciousness speak, you say, our true leaders have been banned and imprisoned on Robben Island. Who are you referring to specifically?
Specifically, we refer to people like Mandela, Sobukwe, people like Govan and Mbeki.
And is it not true that the common factor with these people is that they have advocated violence against the South African government?
The common factor with these people is that they have selflessly pushed forward the struggle of the black man.
So, your answer to this so-called naked terrorism is to provoke violence in the black community.
No, our movement seeks to avoid violence.
But your own words call for direct confrontation.
That's right. We demand confrontation.
Isn't that a demand for violence?
Well, you and I are now in confrontation, but I see no violence.
Biko shamed the South African government, and this embarrassment was the last straw. With the eyes of the world on South Africa, the government knew it needed an excuse to get rid of Biko for good. That excuse came on August 18th, 1977. At a roadblock while returning to his home in King Williamstown after a failed rendezvous with fellow activist Neville Alexander, Biko was identified and arrested. What happened next showed just how terrified of Biko the government of South Africa had become. Following weeks under brutal torture and interrogation, transferred from one prison hold to another with less care than you might show a sack of gone-off potatoes, on September the 12th, 1977, Biko was found naked and beaten to death in a police cell at Port Elizabeth, Pretoria. He was 28. As tragic as Biko's death was for the anti-apartheid struggle, it wasn't in vain. The South African government of course ran cover for the police officers involved in the murder. Until this day, the policemen have never been brought to justice, even post-apartheid. However, what the government of South Africa hadn't bargained for were the worldwide protests against their regime which followed. They hadn't bargained for the international boycotts that were to come, even sanctions. Nor had they bargained for the whole world, white and black alike, using the name South Africa and Afrikaner as a byword for the worst of humanity. Biko's death had started the doomsday clock for the apartheid regime. Afraid and desperate, like an overgrown rodent cornered, the South African government bared their teeth even more. They actually went as far as to ban this shirt, showing the face of Biko and any other shirts like it. The shirt had no words, just Biko's face, and had been created as a memorial shirt for his funeral by friends. But why? Why ban a shirt with a man's face on it? For the same reason the government banned the black community programs that Biko and his friends had established during his life. Yes, the apartheid government went as far as to seize the assets of the different clinics, schools and creches that Biko had worked so hard to create to help black South Africans better themselves. The Afrikaner National Party banned Biko's face because of what it represented, an idea. And as the French writer Victor Hugo once said, there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. While the legacy of Biko remains in the hearts and minds of many South Africans today, both white and black, many in the country still bemoan the good old days. Sadly, many descendants of the white minority that instituted apartheid claim prospects were better for all back in the good old days, not just their white parents and grandparents. Visit online forums on the issue and you will find them the refuge of the sheltered and weak-minded, claiming that they knew nothing of racism while growing up in South Africa and that it was all an international communist propaganda campaign designed to bring down a stable white society. The contradictions in their claim are evidently lost on them. No, they're too busy nursing their loss of a society that should never have been. And yes, atrocities are committed against white farmers today in South Africa. Undoubtedly, Biko would have been appalled at this. Nevertheless, that you can keep your feet on the neck of your fellow man, his children and children's children for centuries and be surprised at the long-lasting bitterness you've created only demonstrates the level of privilege you enjoyed in the first place and very probably still do. When he said this, quote, "As angry as we have the right to be, let us remember that we are in the struggle to kill the idea that one kind of man is superior to another kind of man." Alright guys, white, Bantu or Asian, like and subscribe if you found this video useful at all. And if you agree with us and the men who created the banned Biko shirt of 1977, that ideas matter, then head over to our website throwblack.myshopify.com and pick your favorite shirts to represent our fallen heroes and their unkillable ideas. Also look out for our Biko shirt soon to be released on our website. Meanwhile, this is Throwblack saying peace and love to all, no doubt.